Hi everybody, this is Stephen Pugh, City and Guilds Carpentry and Joinery course. We're going to start video number 8, and video number 8 is going to be dealing with communication, other things as well, but we're going to start with communication. The important thing about communication in the building industry is that it needs to be given in a clear way. You know, we need to say words clearly. Need to make sure that people are understanding the words that we use. There's no point saying something and using a word that people don't know what the word means. And also we need to make sure that not only is the message conveyed clearly, but that it's also received with understanding. And that means that very often when we're giving instruction, we need to check that the people that are listening understand what's being said, and we can ask questions to check that they're understanding. You can say to people, can you explain to me what I've just said, so that we know that we're on the same page. It's very, very important, and many confusions and misunderstandings can occur, especially on a building site, and especially with workers that come from different parts of the country, because they'll have different words for the same thing. Now, the next thing we need to think about is what's called written communication. Written communication is a much more sure way of communicating with other people in terms of carpentry and joinery. Obviously, they can read it many times. The words on the page don't move, they're just fixed. And written communication now has developed into the concept of doing texting. It's possible to text somebody, but the difficulty with text is we need to just be very careful that the texts are not too brief. If the texts are too brief instead of a sentence, then again misunderstandings can come in. And written communication is so very, very essential for building work. You would not believe how much written work, written communication or printed communication is necessary for a building project, right away from the original tender all the way to completion. There's a tremendous amount of written paperwork. But as a carpenter and joiner, you will need to communicate on paper, ideally, if you want the message to be definitely and clearly understood. Now, you may be surprised that as a carpenter there will be lots of bits of paperwork that will be coming your way. So for example, you might have timesheets. That's one of the most important things that you'll have to fill out. And what the timesheet does is it is a record of the time and the work that you've put in earning money. Now at the end of a week, if you find that you haven't got enough money in there, you may discover that you haven't written down correctly all the things that you did or all the time that you spent at work. Another sheet that's very important is called the job sheet. Now, a job sheet is very simply a piece of paper which describes the customer's name, the address, the date. It will have a description of the work to be carried out, and it will have also another part which has interesting details or special instructions. And so every single job that you ever do, whether you're doing the job sheet or not, will have a job sheet. So every job will have a simple job sheet. The next piece of paperwork is number 3, which is the variation order. Now, when I'm going to price work, I will give the price of work on a sheet to somebody. It's a sort of price sheet. However, I will also at the same time give them a blank variation order, and they'll always look at me blank saying, well, what's this for? And I'll say, well, this is so that as we're progressing with the work, if we discover that there's things that need to be done which you or I didn't know about at the time at the beginning, then we can then come to an agreement as to whether the work should be done and how much the work should cost. Now, this should give peace of mind to the worker, because he knows that if he's called upon to do extra work, it can be agreed and he'll be paid. And it also gives peace of mind to the customer or to your boss, because you know very well that you don't have to do work, okay, that isn't been required of you. And the customer knows that they're not going to have a very large bill at the end completely by surprise. So this alleviates all of the difficulties of a lot of building work, and this makes for good relationships between you and your customer. Now, the fourth piece of paperwork necessary is called a requisition order. Now, the word requisition is just a big word. It just means it's a request order. So if you need to go and buy some materials, if you need to go and collect some materials, you'll ask your boss for a requisition order, and he'll write out exactly what it is that you're going to be needing to collect, and you'll take that along to the builder's merchant or to the supplier, and this is a letter effectively from your boss to the supplier, and you're carrying it because you're going to be the one that's going to go and collect the materials. Okay, and the next one, number 5, is called a delivery note. You might have a big lorry turn up with a big pile of timber. That's going to be very common in your experience. The driver will jump out and he'll have in his hand a delivery note. And this is a note that he will be expecting you to sign, which will be a list of all the things that he's going to supply. Now, you need to be careful about signing documents. You need to just think twice about it. For example, have you counted every piece of wood that he's dropping off? Well, there we are. Because if there's some of them missing, then you've signed to say that you've had them. So very often I will say, yes, certainly I'll sign it, but I'll need to just sign it, my signature, and then write underneath it, unchecked. I haven't checked every piece of wood. Okay, and that tells the supplier that actually, yes, you did receive it, but you weren't able to check every little last stick of timber. That's called a delivery note. Now, there's also a delivery record. A delivery record. Now, this is number 6, and this is what every supplier, okay, will have on their records. They will have a record of everything that's been delivered, and hopefully what you've received will be the same as what they think that they've delivered. All sorts of hiccups can happen on something like this, and so that's why these bits of paperwork are so very important. You know, don't you, that just a length of timber can cost £10 or £20. You can't afford to have one missing, you know, because who's going to then supply it when it's missing? Okay. Another one, which is number 7, is called invoices. Now, an invoice is a bill. It's telling the client, it's telling the customer, whoever that person may be, it's telling them that this is the stuff that you've done, or this is the materials that are being supplied, and this is how much it's going to cost you. So an invoice is always a demand for money. It's a demand for the payment of stuff that's been delivered. If you're working on site, or especially if you're helping to supervise a site, there will be what's called a site diary. Now, this is just a blank but a good quality large book. It usually is in the form of a diary, so every time you turn a page it'll have today's date on it, and it's just a large blank expanse, and on that everything that needs to be thought about, everything that happens and everything that needs to be remembered gets written on the diary. And of course there'll be a place for drawing little pictures. They'll be saying, oh, Bill turned up with some timber. And what you can do in the future, if somebody says, do you remember what happened last Tuesday? Then you say, just a minute, and you go back to last Tuesday, and you'll have the written record of everything that happened in relation to you and your work on that record. So there we are. There's 8 items of paperwork that you will have to come into contact with one way or another. The next subject we're going to look at briefly is the subject of verbal communication. That's all the written communication. Now we're going to talk about verbal. Now, verbal means speaking. Okay, this is speaking communication, and there's a tremendous amount that we could say about this, but we're just going to bring out a few basics. The first thing is about taking a telephone message. Now, you wouldn't think that we would need to actually teach anybody how to take a telephone message. It's such a simple thing. But you know what? There are certain features of this message that have to be spoken about. First of all, when you're using the telephone, you need to speak clearly. And you need to ask the other person on the other end to speak clearly as well, because You need to be able to hear, and you need to be able to speak in such a way that people are listening and taking note properly. There need to be at least 4 things written down on the note that you take. First of all, there needs to be the message itself. Tell Fred to come next Tuesday with the plumber. See, if that's the message, then you need to make sure you've got the right date recorded. It's next Tuesday. You need to record that it's going to be with Fred the plumber. See what I mean? So that message needs to be written down as a sentence. The next thing you need to then do is put the date and time on that message. And you need to say on that message who the message is for. So at the top of it, you might say to the site supervisor, to Fred or Bill, the site supervisor. And also, you need to ask before they leave the telephone conversation, say, can you just tell me what your name is? Who is the person giving us this message? And can you tell me what your details are? Do we have your contact details so that we can ring you back and ask further questions? Okay, so that's taking a telephone message. Now, sometimes we have a thing called time-sensitive messages. Time-sensitive message. Now, a time-sensitive message is simply a message whereby action needs to take place immediately. There's going to be no time to wait. It's sensitive in that sense. You need to act upon it immediately. Now, there are a number of things about communication that we sadly need to talk about. Sometimes in communication, we need to remember that some communication can be deemed as being unacceptable. Unacceptable communication. For example, communication sometimes might be aggressive, swearing or using inappropriate hand gestures. It sometimes is the case that communication is racist or sexist or makes certain gestures that are very unpleasant. They're not good at all. It's assumed, on building sites, everybody's rough and tumble and everybody swears a lot. Well, that's not necessarily the case really at all. You're expected to be a professional. You're expected to be an upright person of society, and showing racist remarks or being sexist towards people is just not appropriate anymore. Showing prejudice against people is also not acceptable, and those prejudices could be hundreds. There's hundreds of varieties of prejudice that could be shown. For example, we might think of people with disabilities. Perhaps somebody can't hear. Perhaps somebody is a little bit slow to pick things up. We don't call them names, and we don't be cruel in the way in which we speak. And in fact, sometimes people get hauled up before tribunals, and sometimes they can lose their employment because of things that they say which are unpleasant and unkind or rude. Okay, so let's come off the subject of communication. We're now going to turn to a different subject. It's the knowledge of the construction industry and the built environment. Now, the construction industry and the built environment means basically the same thing. We're going to talk about how buildings are constructed. That's what we're going to do. We're going to start at the very foundation, literally. We're going to talk about foundations. So foundations serve as a very solid base upon which everything else is then constructed. There are 2 sorts of loads that a building has. It has the dead load. Obviously, a building is heavy. It's made of heavy things, wood and brick and stone and steel and roof tiles and all these things. They're all heavy. And if you were able to put all of the materials of a building into a scale, that would be called the dead load. But a building is made up of more than just the dead load. When people walk into the building then takes on their weight as well. When furniture or heavy machinery is put inside a building, that also increases the weight. And even if it snows heavily and there's a couple of ton of snow on the roof, that also adds to the weight, and that's called an imposed load. An imposed load. So we've got the dead load and we've got the imposed load. Now this is very important because when a building is going to be constructed, what the architects and the structural engineers will do is they'll work out what is the dead load. Then they will add to that what they believe to be the imposed load. Then what they will do is take samples of the soil and the clay where the building is going to, they might do a number of boreholes right the way down and take those samples and take them to a laboratory and test them. They'll test them to see if they're soft, they'll test them to see how resilient they are, and depending on, first of all, the soil condition. Is it clay? Is it sandy? You see, the depth of the soil they want to talk about, the depth of the water table. Now that's an interesting thing. I don't know whether you knew this, but the water has water in the ground has what they call a level. It's called a water table. I don't know whether you've ever dug a hole in the garden, and you dig a hole in the garden, as you go down deep, suddenly it starts to fill up with water and it keeps coming up and then it stops. Because what happens is the ground is full of water up to a certain level. And if you dig below that level, then you're going to find that the water will come into the hole. Of course, if you have water that's above the ground level, then it's a pond. As simple as that. If you have water that's above ground level, then it's a lake. Okay, but if you're above the ground level, then the ground is dry, but the water below it is obviously wet. You see, so these are all things that need to be taken into account. And also, one of the other things that needs to be taken into account is whether the ground has any contaminants present. I mean, it might have diesel, it might have chemicals, but it also might have gases. Okay, so all these things have to be taken into account and considered when deciding what foundation is to be put into the ground. Now, the next thing we need to think about is concrete. Concrete is this amazing substance, invented over 2,000 years ago. It's this wonderful substance in which you're able to take tiny little stones or rocks and you're able to bind them together with sand and cement and with water to turn it into what is a rock-like substance. That substance, which is able to be shaped to whatever shape you want it to be, that rock-like substance makes like a wonderful foundation for a house. If you have in a brick house, for example, you can't afford the foundation to move, otherwise the bricks will crack and there'll be cracks in the walls. It's got to remain solid. And so it's very common for people to put concrete into the ground and build upon the concrete. You need to remember, by the way, if ever you're involved in putting concrete in the ground, that the cement that concrete is made of is quite caustic. What I mean by that is it's quite acidic, and you can get some quite severe burns to your skin by being in contact with concrete or being in contact with the cement. Now, in the building trade and in the construction industry, we have lots of different types of concrete. There are the low strength concretes going right the way up to industrial strength. In fact, there's probably 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different strengths of concrete. The way in which concrete is made is that it's basically a mixture of sand and cement, and then added to it is fine stones. Now, those stones may be very small little pebbles, or they might be quite jagged ones. It just depends on what the concrete foundation is going to be expected to do. Okay, and you can go all the way from low strength to medium strength to strong concrete to stronger concrete to very strong concrete and to industrial strength concrete. So to give you a sort of to give you an idea, if you were mixing mortar for a bricklayer, you very often would use 1 in 4. So 4 shovelfuls of sand to 1 shovelful of cement. So that's a 4 in 1 ratio. However, if at the same time you then went to a pile of aggregate, which is a pile of fine stones, and you put in 9 shovels of stones, you would end up with a fairly ideal, strong building concrete. And so that then has a ratio of 1 to 4 and 9, 1, 4, 9. and that produces quite a super strong concrete. Now, the other thing about concrete is that there can be additives put into it. Some of these additives will slow the process of curing down. Concrete doesn't just dry. It does dry, of course, because it's wet, but it doesn't just dry, it cures. This concrete is not just drying out, it's actually a chemical reaction. That's what's happening. So you can put retardants in it which slow the chemical reaction down if you want it to be a longer mix, and you can also put accelerants in it if you want it to dry faster. Okay, these chemicals sometimes are frost resistant, so you can be laying concrete even on a very, very chilly day. Of course, you wouldn't want to lay it on a freezing day. Don't forget, water freezes, so we don't want crystals of water to be forming inside the cement. But this goes to show, and of course there's another thing that you can add to cement, which is colour. You can make it a different colour. You can make it grey. You can make it pink cement, make it green cement, whatever you wish. Of course, you'd have to use a lot of colour, and it would be quite expensive, but it's something that can be done. So this gives us a little bit of an introduction into foundations. Now, next time, we're going to be talking about all the different types of foundations and how important it is to be able to make the right sort of foundation for the right sort of building. There we are. We look forward to speaking to you next time. Have a great day. Bye for now.